So today we're going to talk a little bit about gut health, and that's an unusual term because when you use the word gut, a lot of times people picture a big fat abdomen. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the intestine. And this is a really interesting body system because although we use it every single day, we all are aware of it, it's just astonishing how little we have known about this. And part of that is that it's really hard to study. It's a couple dozen feet long. It's pretty easy to look at the esophagus, the tube between the mouth and the stomach, and it's pretty easy to look at the stomach and even down into the small intestine that is the first part of the intestine off of the stomach, because you can stick a scope down there and you can see pretty well. And then it's reasonably easy to look at the colon, which is the large intestine, and you can do a colonoscopy. That requires a prep because you got to get stool out of the colon because it's not transparent. But you can study the colon pretty well. But you've got over 20 feet of small intestine between those two, and that's where all of the digestion in the body occurs. All the digestion in the intestine occurs in the small intestine, and it's almost impossible to study. There have been scopes that can look at the entire small intestine. I won't go into how to do that. It's pretty strange. Most of the time we don't do that anymore. Now we actually have somebody swallow a little pill that has a camera in it, and it looks at the small intestine. But that's just what it looks like. The real issue is how does it function? And this has required an enormous amount of work, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the function of the small intestine. And it turns out that this is really an important area of the body. Now, having said that, it's also kind of illustrative to mention that the entire inside of your gastrointestinal system, from mouth to anus, is not inside your body. It's outside your body, the inside of the intestine. It's like the hole through a donut. The hole isn't part of the donut, it's just air. And so it goes through the body. It's a long tunnel that goes through the body, and it processes things that stay outside the body, so it lets some of those things inside the body into the bloodstream. And so there's a barrier that's the lining of the intestine that basically decides what can go in and out of the body that way. And a lot of this stuff that is the function of the intestine, it's figuring out what is okay to get into the bloodstream through the cells and what's not. So thinking about gut health or intestinal health means how does that function stay healthy and what's required for that? Well, it turns out that one of the major things that's required for that is actually germs that live on the surface of the intestine. Now, everybody can understand that there's lots of germs that live in the large intestine. Obviously, the large intestine is where stool is formed. But the small intestine, although it has a much lower number of germs that live there, it does have germs that live there. And they're not just there for the ride, they're actually part of the function of the intestine. One thing that they do is they compete with other germs that are living there. And that's a really important function, because if just one type of germ lived there, then it would have all of the food supply and it would overgrow, and then you would have too much of one kind of germ living in the small intestine. And you don't want to have that. You want to have a balance. So that's the principle behind probiotic therapy, or at least it's a major principle behind that. So you put a bunch of different germs into the intestine, and they all have to fight with each other so that the food supply isn't just for one species of germ, but they all have to fight for it. And as a result, nobody gets to overgrow and become, so to speak, king of the hill. And so then you don't get overgrowth. Now, once in a while, there will be an imbalance of this germ population, which is referred to as the intestinal microbiome. And if there's an imbalance in that population, then you do have overgrowth of one or another of the germs that live there. And when they overgrow, then they can start to produce various different symptoms. And we're all familiar with those. It can cause gas or bloating or diarrhea or constipation or abdominal pain, those kinds of things. Some of them could even cause invasive disease and get into the wall of the intestine itself and might actually cause bleeding. So erosions or ulcers or things like that could be caused by some of these. But making sure that the microbiome of the intestine is balanced is really an important thing. And you think, well, wouldn't it be better if it was just sterile? And that would be a possible way of not having any germs overgrow. But the problem is that it's just impossible to make the intestine sterile. So then it's better for it to be dirty, so to speak, but in a balanced way so that it's not out of balance.